We have a lady from Lindisfarne on line 2, and we'll take her. Hello, ma'am. This is George Teal. You're from Lindisfarne?
New Cambria.
Do you have what is your name, please?
Cindy Rockhold.
Cindy Rockhold?
Yeah.
Cindy, can you tell us what the situation is in New Cambria?
Well, the tornado, it went through the middle of town, and it hit the post office, and it knocked out a couple of store windows, but the police and ambulances are down there now, but I'm not sure if there's any injuries or anything.
What was the extent of the damage at the post office, do you know?
I think it just hit the red was down there, and police and ambulances have been going by ever since it happened.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, keep your cool, and if you get some more information on if there were any injuries or maybe any more damage, please give us a call back, okay?
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. We have Ken on line 3, so let us take that call. And Ken?
Yeah, Mike, I wanted to report that there has been quite a lot of damage in the Cambria area. Of course, we've had reports before, but they're moving people into Salina. Certainly to stay off of the emergency routes, and that would be probably Old Highway 40.
But I did see them going. Can't remember them being huge tornadoes, but I remember them being more just dark blue, maybe, I don't know. And they seemed like they were a smaller tornado and more dancing around. It wasn't just a huge one like you see in a lot of videos where they just mow across country. But the 3 there that look like smaller ones. The first one I'd seen in Salina looked like a bigger one, especially for me to be able to see it from that distance. But I didn't watch a lot because my sis, brother-in-law, and they had 2 small kids, lived in New Cambria, and I wanted to keep my eye on the road because I wanted to get there because I had no clue what had happened. I knew New Cambria had been hit, but that's all I
knew. And the older you are, the more experience you've had. If you manage to live through it, you only get stronger. Oh, I'm Bruce Wesley Loder. Now I'm going to be 65 in 1 month. I was born in Little River, Kansas. I was raised 6 miles south of Knapp Lake near a very small community called Langley. Right now we live in the country close to Brookville, Kansas. I don't really do anything now. I retired from the Air Force and then I retired from remodeling. So if a friend needs help, I go and help them. I'm in the Master Gardeners, I'm in the VFW Riders. I like to fish and help people out once in a while. That's pretty much it. I don't have to worry about going to an 8-to-5 job anymore. Started out in the Air Force in antenna maintenance. I always called it pole jockey. Climbed power poles, you might say, except they weren't power, they were antennas. Climbed towers. While stationed at Andrews, just on the edge of Washington, D.C., kind of a suburb, really. It's where the president always flies out of. It's where I was working in antenna maintenance, and I climbed a 300-foot tower, which in my group, I know there are taller towers and people that crawl taller, climb taller towers, but they told me that out of all the people in my section, even guys who've been in there 20 years, I'd climbed higher than anybody. I did that out at a top secret radio site. Then after I did that for a while, I cross-trained. I became a chapel management specialist. I always kind of shortened it chaplain's assistant because everybody always kind of thought of it as that. Worked in chapels, got stationed in 7 different bases in just under 4 years. Really got tired of moving. They offered me orders to go to England if I would re-enlist then, and they'd send me there for 3 years. Vietnam was winding down. I wasn't too worried about going to Vietnam anymore. Not that I ever was, because I'd volunteered for Vietnam. They sent me to Korea instead. But the wife and I had decided that when my 4 years was up, I would get out and spend time with her and my young son and my just then newborn, well, as a matter of fact, at that time, still not quite born baby. Just barely not born yet.
Well, my name is Linda Loder, and I was born in 1951 in Hoisington, Kansas. My maiden name was Fletcher, and I guess if you do the math, that means I am going to be 64 years old in a couple of weeks. My birthday is July the 4th. My husband and I live in the country near Brookville, Kansas now. We've been married 46 years next month, and we've lived here since 1984, I believe, spring of 1984. My husband and I lived in New Cambria, Kansas in September of 1973 when the tornado came through that area. I've always had a big fear of tornadoes from when I was a child. We actually rode one out in a car at Canopolis Lake whenever we were small children. We were out camping with my parents and my grandparents at the time, and a big storm came up, and there was a tornado that came through that area and did a lot of damage to the lake area, the campgrounds, so on and so forth. And we rode it out in a car and watched the trees crashing all around and everything. So I have a big respect for them. That day in September of '73, the weather was hot and steamy and just had that greenish, grayish look you get in the sky whenever it's going to brew a storm. And I'd been listening to the radio, and they were talking about all the weather conditions.
So I got out, and first thing I did was go to work for a heating and air conditioning place. And from there, the business isn't in business anymore, but it was a hot, windy day one day. We were working. It's September 25th, 1973. There's no reason I would have ever remembered that date except for what happened later. Got home, and my dad had always raised us not to worry about storms. We'd stand down on the front steps during severe storms and never think anything of it. Kind of always got a thrill out of it, like a lot of people do. Never once in my whole life had I ever gone to the basement for a storm, ever. And I didn't think anything more of it. I hadn't listened to the radio, though. And when I got home that night, my wife, who was very antsy, I guess is one word for it, very nervous, she had two very young children. And she said I would take them to the basement and she would make supper, and I kind of laughed at her. She said if I wanted supper, I would go to the basement. So I did want supper, so I went to the basement with the children. Wasn't down there very long at all when the wife came down the stairs looking pretty scared. She said that everything had got dead still outside, where it had been hot and fairly windy and very humid all day. And now it had gotten very quiet. And we both said, well, we knew that this was what we had heard happens right before a tornado usually hit. She, I think, if I remember right, started to go back up the stairs, or maybe did go back up the stairs, but she ran right back down as she did.
And I finally got nervous enough about it. I scooped up my children and took them down in the basement of the house to play. At that time, our oldest son, Matt, was, well, he was going on 2. He was born in December, so he was going on 2. And we had a baby girl who was 5 months old. And I took them down in the basement, and we were just playing with the toys and stuff and had the radio going down there. Bruce came home from work, my husband, and hollered out, because he was tired and he was hungry, and said, "What's going on? Where's supper?" And I said, "If you want supper, you got to come down in the basement and watch the kids." He said, "Oh, you've been listening to the weather reports again." And I said, "Yep, and if you want supper, you're going to come down in the basement with the kids, and I'll go upstairs and make dinner." And he was kind of picking on me, but he went downstairs and I went upstairs, and we had the windows open and listening to the wind and the radio going, and the power went out, so couldn't cook anyway. And then it got really still, and I ran downstairs and I said, "It got real quiet outside." I said, "That's an indication." And Bruce went upstairs and listened, and he came back down. He said, "You're right, it really did." And then you could hear it. You could hear the rumble, the train sound everybody says they make. It really does. I remember being pretty scared, but I was more worried about what was going to happen to the children. That's what you usually worry about, I think, when you're parents. I wasn't afraid I was going to die or anything like that. I don't think we were scared of that. I think we were just scared of what we were going to see when we got out of there, about how much mess it was going to be, or if everybody else was going to be all right. Oh, like they say, any tornado does really sound like a railroad train coming through. And it's, there really isn't anything else to describe it but a train track, sounding like the train's coming down. There weren't a lot of trains came through that area, but we were pretty close to the track. So. Just was coming from the wrong direction to be the train. And so we got the children and got under the stairway of the basement, because Bruce said that's where you go whenever there's a tornado. You go under the stairway, so we did.
And then we started hearing the tornado. I had never experienced, I'd seen tornadoes from a long ways off. Even when we were dating, one night it was a bad storm, and we'd seen one dip down and all the flashes of lightning and whip back up. You live in Kansas, it's hard to say you're never going to see a tornado, although some never have. This is the first time I was actually in a house that was about to be hit by one. That was a whole different thing. The sound started building up louder and louder, and there was like a vacuum, a pressure or something. Your ears were popping so fast that you couldn't swallow fast enough to try to equalize your eardrums. The children started screaming. I was trying to get them to calm down, but it's pretty hard to get them to calm down when you're pretty excited yourself.
You could hear it, and you could hear the noise it was making, and the trees breaking and the glass breaking. And I remember I kind of started to cry, and he said, "Don't do that, you'll scare the children." And so I stopped, and the kids were too little. You know, they didn't really cry or anything. They didn't know what was going on.
And we had a window in the basement that you could look out, and at that time we had trees that had been planted before we ever bought the place. We'd only owned the house about 3 months. And there was like a tall tree and a cedar tree, a tall tree, a cedar tree, a tall tree, and so on when you looked out the window. When the tornado really came in over us, we could hear all the glass breaking in the house. We heard the freight train going through the house. It's very, very scary listening to everything shatter and break, and you don't know if you have a house left. You don't know what's going on. You're in the basement, swallowing as fast as you can, trying to calm your children down, and everything is just total chaos. Looking out the window, it got almost totally black, but it was a brownish color to it, like mud almost in the air. It was hard to see exactly what was there, but the first thing I remember noticing, just as it was coming, was the trees were whipping like this. And I mean, they were tall but slender trees. And they were bending over like this. The tops were like touching the ground. These trees must have been 30 feet tall. And they were bending clear down, whipping the ground. And then it got so dark, you couldn't see anything. And then, very quickly, you could. except now you could see it, but there were no trees. And so I thought it's passed, even though the noise had let up, it was still there, but it wasn't as loud. The trees weren't moving. Of course, there were no trees that I could see anymore. And I ran up the stairs, and I saw that part was still there, but we had a 2-story house. I saw every window in the place shattered, gone. I just saw insulation. It was just a mess everywhere.
I just mostly remember the noise and then it getting very quiet again as it passed away. And then there was a lot of wind after that. Bruce ran upstairs and ran out the window onto the porch roof upstairs in the second floor, and he watched it. He said, I'm sure he already told you that it hung in the air, and he watched it for a while before it moved on away. And then he came back downstairs, and we waited a while before we went on up, because you just never know if there's something else out there.
I took the stairs and went to the upstairs to see if maybe I still had an upstairs. And I did. Same thing though up there, everything was just destroyed, window-wise and things like that. So one of the windows you could step out onto a porch roof, and I stepped out and I looked up and saw the tornado that had just hit us. And the thing probably was not 100 yards away from me. And I remember looking up and seeing pieces of signs and lumber, pieces of trees, all stuff, and it was dependent on where it was in the tornado. In the closer part, they looked like they were whirling faster, and in the further out part, it was almost like the Wizard of Oz. When you see the house going around, you could see these pieces of wood floating around, lumber and things. And it was so close and so scary to be that close to it that I ran back downstairs and I was telling my wife what I had saw, what had happened. And then the sound got quieter, so then we all came upstairs. We went outside, and the yard, it was almost like my yard was the vacuum point for debris. There was a place called Sundowner East, which was a mobile home, I guess, I don't know what you call it, a park. It was gone. We found parts of their mobile homes in my yard. There was a tavern, a bar down the street from me. We found his beer sign in my yard. It's like from far and near, they ended up in my yard. I looked across the alley just on the south side of me. It had been I believe a cinder block building. And the only thing that was there, standing, I mean, the cinder block building was wiped out. There was a slab, there was a toilet, and there was a hot water heater. Still standing. Everything else gone. How cinder blocks can fly around and not shatter the toilet and take out the hot water heater too. Tornadoes do some strange things.
I remember going outside or finding our way outside through the rubble and just being amazed at where everything had gone, because the firehouse was in the block behind our place and it was gone. The whole firehouse was just gone. We had trees all around the property, they were gone. The shop was gone except for the garage part that was over my car. You couldn't get the car out because of all the debris, but the car was still in there. The roof was torn up. Every ceiling in the house had fallen in, and every window had sucked to the inside, so there was broken glass everywhere. And I think the thing that struck me the most was there was a big chunk in the woodwork, the trim around the floor, had been chopped out by the flying glass where the baby used to lay on her blanket while I cooked dinner in the kitchen. And I remember thinking I was right. We needed to be in the basement. Just the mess everywhere, the whole town. Some of the guys, I think Bruce was with them, were looking for the old lady that lived in the house next door to us, and they found her in the central closet in her house holding the doorknob shut. But she was all right. Nobody in the town had died. There was just a lot of destruction. And we were kind of looking around going, okay, what do you do now? Because you couldn't get out of town. And of course, that's long before there are cell phones or anything. And all the phones were dead, all the power lines were down.
I looked at the house to the east of me, and it was like this. I looked at the house across the street from that person, slightly toward me, but mostly across from that person. And it was messed up really bad. The house next to it, the roof had been picked up and then dropped and just come crashing back down on the house. Their story was a little bit interesting because everybody was talking afterwards. I went over to talk to them. Of course, everybody's wandering around a little like zombies. But they said that the husband that night had just got home from work just like I had. Hadn't listened to the radio just like I hadn't. And apparently the wife hadn't listened to the radio either. And a friend of theirs, or a relative, I don't know, called him up and said, "Did you hear about the tornado that's about to hit New Cambria?" And they was just sitting down to eat supper. Maybe had just sat down, but I mean, that's what they said. They had just sat down or something. And when they got the phone call, they said, "You better hit the basement now." So they scrambled and went to the basement, and that's when the roof came up and came crashing down, and the table and everything where they'd been was gone, destroyed.
Tornadoes kept moving north. I could see nothing to the south or west behind me. So I drove on up, pulled off at the edge of New Cambria on the west side, kind of angled off towards into town. And I couldn't get very far. There were high lines down and trees, and I remember walking past one mobile home that was turned completely upside down on the north, setting on the north side of the street. And if I remember correct, there was one setting about this same area before. But Lynn and Bruce's house was probably about 300 or 400 yards from where I parked the car. It may have been a little further. Kind of hard to remember right now. But I climbed over tree limbs and down power lines. I didn't really see any power lines down, but the poles themselves were down, so I knew they were. But I think everything had kind of went to the north, and I was along the south side of the street, mostly in yards, because you couldn't get down the street at all. They were just full of trash and junk. Got through up close to Lynn and Bruce's house where I could see it, and around all the other stuff, all I could see was where the front porch should have been, and they had 2 big cedar trees on the porch, and those were gone. Turns out later on, found out the cedar trees were just laying over. They were still in the yard, but they were laying down. It had torn the front porch off the house. But I didn't know whether the house was still there or not, because I knew they'd been hit some. Well, about the time I got just almost to the edge of the street to their house, and I could see their house, the corner of it, so I knew it was still there. And then I saw Linda was first.
And looked up down the street, and here came my kid brother walking down the street in the middle of there. He didn't live anywhere close to us, but he had gotten the notion that afternoon that he was going to come and visit us, and he didn't call or anything. He just decided when he got off work he was going to come and see us. And so he was driving his car down the interstate and saw the storm from the other vantage point, saw it coming at us, and kind of followed it in.
And my brother-in-law, Roger, he had borrowed a bicycle from me. I don't remember how long he'd had it, it didn't matter. He didn't tell us he was bringing it back to us, and he didn't tell us it was that particular night. And there we were standing in a town buried in trees and broken homes. Electricity, of course, was gone. What a terrible mess. And he come walking down the street. And he lived, I think, at that time at Hutchinson. I could be wrong, but I think that's right. And what are you doing here? And tonight of all nights, he said, oh, I decided to bring your bicycle back to you. And he said, but when I was just outside of town, I saw this tornado coming right at the town. He said, so I stopped, and he said there was 3 tornadoes. I said, 3? Of course, I was kind of busy with the one we had. I didn't realize there was more than one. And he said, yeah, there was 3 of them. He said there was the one in town, there was 2 more over here in the field.
And then Bruce was behind her, and she was carrying the 2 little kids, one of them less than a year old, and the other one like about a year and a half at that time. And of course, they were just eyes as big as saucers walking around looking at their house and up at it. Of course, I was there close enough, and I yelled at them, and they were about as surprised to see me because they didn't even know I was coming up. But worked out pretty well that way, because then there was 2 of us that night. Bruce and I went back and boarded the house up. But we got things kind of settled down, gathered some clothes up for Linda and the kids. No cell phones, no way to contact, family or anything, because the whole town was just completely dead. We loaded up the kids, Linda, and we got in my little bug going into Salina. And we called family, so everybody knew everybody was all right, and then I was with Bruce, and we were going to go back to New Cambria.
The cleanup was just immense. They took huge truckloads of stuff out of our yard. It was like half the rubble. We found rubble from Sundowner in our yard. Stuff that we'd never seen before ended up in our yard, and I suppose our stuff ended up somebody else's. The Mennonites, I have a huge amount of respect for those people. They came in and helped a lot in town with the cleanup. They brought shovels and equipment, and helped load the county trucks that came in. They brought the county dump trucks in and just filled them up with piles and piles of everything out of the town and took it out to the dump.
Don't be afraid to run in a hole in the ground when they come by.
We have 1 fatality reported from the Niles area. We don't have any details on who that was or anything, and that information will be forthcoming from law enforcement agencies later as they continue to search through the wreckage from the tornado that moved through that area.
My name is Thomas Leo Barrett. I'm 78 years old, and I live close to the small town of Niles, Kansas. I'm a year and a half older than God. Yeah, I was born in Niles, Kansas. We lived in the town at that time. And my father ran the elevator, the grain elevator, and of course my mother actually was a college graduate in the first graduating class of Marymount College. And her parents were both killed by the train in a train wreck at Solomon. And my mother was teaching school in Niles at the one-room schoolhouse they had, all 9 grades, and they had, at that time, they had 14 students and 1 teacher. And the teacher also did the janitor work, the painting, and pumped the water. There was no running water, and there were outhouses for restrooms kind of adjacent to the schoolhouse. It was a wood frame school, and they burnt coal. And And it was so cold in there, on a 20-degree day, you could see your breath. And her pay, she got $17 a month for teaching in it was grade and high school, both combined. People's children didn't have TV sets and all that. The first thing they were handed was a broad axe and a shovel and a pitchfork and a pair of gloves so they could help do the chores. And a lot of them never went to school till they were 10, 12 years old. Everybody provided their own transportation. There was no school buses or anything. There was horses and another product they call shoe leather. I had a brother named Michael, older, 2 years older. My brother was very, very intelligent, but my mother had a hard time with the rules and regulations with him. So when I got to be 10, 11 years old, my mother told me, she said, well, you're going to go be a priest. And she said, I just haven't figured out where I'm going to send you. Well, I thought she was joking, to be right honest with you. But so then she acquired down in Atchison with the Benedictine priests, and they had a boarding school and down there for high school students in the priesthood. Well, they at Moore Hill, we only did three things. We prayed, studied, and played football, and that was it. So I applied for a scholarship to play football. The bishop in Salina had one scholarship, athletic scholarship, for priesthood students. So I applied for it my freshman year, and I got it for my sophomore year, and then I applied again my junior year and my senior year, and then I went to St. Benedict's for 3 years on the same scholarship. But the catch was, when I came down to sign the papers to be a priest, I talked to my mother, and she said that, she left that up to me. Of course, I was like 19 years old at that time, 18 or 19. And I said, I just don't think this is a vocation for me. I said, I like the kids I go to school with, because they were all very, very intelligent, and I went to a one-room schoolhouse in Niles that in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, I was the only student in that class. And you talk about a dummy. And when I got to Moore Hill, I was compared to the rest of them, I was illiterate. I wrote the bishop a letter and said I decided I didn't want to become a priest. And about a month later, I got a letter back and said, well, that's fine, we understand and all that, but we want the grant money back. Well, I went to K-State one year too, that's right. And I tried out for football down there, and them Chicago boys that weighed about 275 to 3 1/4, they about killed me. And I decided that they can use instead of me for a dummy or a punching bag, they could use one of them bags that somebody could hold and not use my body. So I went out for football, but I didn't stay but just about 6 weeks. Well, after I quit down at K-State, I went full-time farming then. You know what I did? WORK. That's what I did. As far as, you got to remember too, see, we only had basic TV. We had We started with Channel 12, KTVH. In fact, we had the first TV set in probably Ottawa County, right here in this house. It was 3-inch screen, and it was in a console. But basically, we watched, back then was westerns. Gunsmoke was one of them, and I never forget. We always watched Hee-Haw. We always watched Hee-Haw. Janice and I grew up in an age of like Tony Bennett, and we used to go dancing once in a while. And country western wasn't the big deal like it is now, but it was Tony Bennett, and what was some of her favorites? Paul Anka. Well, of course, Lawrence Welk, because Janice's folks were here all the time, and they were, they liked that. But music wasn't. I'm not musically inclined, to be right honest with you. Well, a couple drinks and anybody can dance. You know what I mean?
We interrupt this program to bring you the following tornado warning from the United States Weather Bureau.
On September 25th, 1973, my wife, Janice, had noticed on the TV that they were giving a tornado warning for this area. It was actually over Salina at Sundowner East. That's where it was. And it was heading towards New Cambria, and would be in the Niles area approximately 4:30 till 5 o'clock in the evening. So we got in my pickup and was going to drive down to we lived on another farm north of Niles, and we had Mark, my youngest son, was with us. So we drove down to my mother's, and we got about to the cemetery and saw the dark cloud right at the river, and it was about it was at least a half-mile wide. And then on pickup radio, they said it was on the ground north of the Cambria and Niles area. So that was it. So we stopped right by the cemetery north of Niles, and it got real dark, and it sounded like a locomotive, to be right honest with you. But once it got down on this farm, I could really see it. But when it came through here, this field is about a half-mile wide, and it covered the whole field. It was wheat growing time, but like I said, the dirt, it was sucking so much dirt you couldn't see. You could see it swirling, but you couldn't see any tree limbs or anything in it because of the damn dirt. So it picked a lot of loose dirt up out of the fields, and you couldn't see nothing for. It got dark just like the sun went down with the dirt from the tornado. It stayed on the ground and went clear on, and it got some tombstones up in the cemetery, and it went on up, clear up to 18. It was still on the ground, and hit the bird farm. You know where the bird farm is up there? And see, Bernie Jansen raised pheasants and quail and stuff, and he sold them. Well, it tore all that netting down, and we had the greatest pheasant hunting in the whole world here for 10 years. He had 25 or 30,000 pheasants and chuckers, and there was a damn many of them. They were roosting in the trees, sitting on the fence posts, and we had the fattest coyotes in the whole state of Kansas, because the netting all got tore down. And by the time the tornado got through Niles and the dirt cleared up, it wasn't quite dark, but almost. You could see power lines down and sparking on the lines. So we drove down to Niles and there was the big grain tanks were at the elevator. I think there was, I don't know if there were 7 or 8 of them that had been blown from their concrete foundations and rolled up. They looked like tin cans that were rolled around over town, and some of them had run over buildings. And then we turned west on the Niles Road to come down here at my mother's, and we drove in, and the hay shed was gone. I had a great big hay shed out here. I had 10,000 bales of hay in there I had put in there by hand, and it was gone. There was 1 bale of hay left. And there was poles out of the hay shed that had jammed in the windows of the house. So I got out of the truck and went in the back door and hollered for my mother, and she hollered, but I couldn't. She said, "I'm in the bedroom." And she was under the bed, but one of those poles out of that shed had lit on the bed, and she couldn't get out from underneath the bed. And so I hollered at Janice. She came in, and we lifted the pole off, and then she crawled out from under there, and she was she was just at wit. She couldn't figure out. She saw it coming and didn't think about going to the basement because this house had a full basement under it. So she just crawled under the bed. Well, by that time it was dark, and you couldn't really see exactly because there was no lights. Everything was gone. There was all headlights and flashlights. But her house had shifted between 6 inches and a foot off of the foundation. And of course it broke her gas line and her water line then. And she said, "Well, I'm going to stay here anyway," because I got a lot of, well, she did have a lot of valuable paintings because she was a painter, and she'd bought some, and she said, "I'm going to stay here until tomorrow morning and talk to the adjuster." So about that time, it started hailing tennis balls, and I got my pickup in under a building someplace. I don't remember where it was right now because it was a almost new truck. And then later on that night, it rained between 8 and 9 inches, just poured. But it blew the tops off. I had some wheat stored out here, or on my mother's farm, and took the tops off of them, and all that rain in there, and I had 4,000 or 5,000 bushels, which was, a lot of money to me at that time, because wheat was $6.75 a bushel, I think it was. But then we drove back uptown, and it was just a mess.
My name is Jerry Rock, and I'm 72 years old, and I was born in Wahoo, Nebraska, and grew up in a little town of Broughton, which is east of Clay Center, and it's no longer there due to the Milford Lake. My folks, this is a little bit different. My folks were divorced when I was 11 months old, and my grandmother, who lived at Broughton, which would have been my mother's mother, took me in and raised me until I was 23 years old. So I lived with my grandmother all my life in Broughton, Kansas. And she'd already raised her 6 kids, and she raised me, and she died in 1964, and I'd already gone to Salina, but she raised me from 11 months old on to 23. I always tell people I ran away from home at age 23. But she was a good gal, big, strict woman, and you towed the mark with her. I went to school at Broughton for 7 years, grade school, and 4 years at Clay Center Community High School. I worked for farmers, and moving irrigation pipe and baling hay, and then of course when I got out of high school I I worked for the county for a year and a half or 2 years until I got enough money to go to Brown Mackie. And then I moved to Salina in 1963 or 4, somewhere in there. My mother was remarried 4 other times, and I have a half-brother that lives in Los Angeles. That's the only 2 children that she had. She had me and my brother, and he's 10 years younger than I am. And he lives in LA, and he's a big chemical engineer for the skunk works out in the desert, works for the government. And I think he's going to retire pretty soon. I asked him what he did out there, and he said, well, if I tell you, I'll have to kill you. So I said, I don't want to know. After I got out of Brown Mackie, I had a job as a bookkeeper, and I worked there for 3 years and did not like that. And then I got a job at Beach Aircraft in 1966 and worked there till 2002. And I was a tool inspector at Beach Aircraft. Well, it was actually Raytheon towards the end, but they changed names, but Beach Aircraft when I started. Good job. It's, for no college degree or anything, I thought it was a very good job. Paid good, had good insurance, and I enjoyed it. But it got to changing a little towards the end, and I was glad to give it up and retire. They were bringing a lot of young people in out of college that thought they knew how to do the job, and they didn't have a clue really, but they'd read about it in books, and so it made it a little bit tough for a 30-year person to do that. And then computers came in, which was a little bit hard to do when you're 60-some years old. But it was a good job. I enjoyed it. Met my wife there, and we've known each other for 40 years, and it was some good people. I enjoyed it. We had 1,300 people there at one time. So I have a son and a daughter, and my daughter is a pharmacist at the Andover Hospital, and my son is living in Minneapolis, and he does carpeting and tile work. On September the 25th, 1973, the best I can remember is that I was living next door to the mortuary in Solomon, and Gene Carlson ran an ambulance service, and I would go on calls with him. I had no medical training, but I would go either drive or go with him. I had no training whatsoever. He was just a good friend of mine, and we did things together, and he just trusted that I would, I didn't do anything that, I don't know, in 73, it might have been a good reason for a lawsuit, but I did not have any training whatsoever sometimes I drove the ambulance, and if somebody needed medical attention, then he would be in the back with them, and then I would drive the Suburban. So I was unprofessional, really. I was just a good friend and a neighbor. And he called me and said that Salina had been hit by a tornado and they needed some ambulances, so we got in this Chevy Suburban, which he had converted into an ambulance, and we headed out towards Salina on Old 40, and we got out just past the river bridge, not very far, and the tornado, it looked enormous. It looked like it was right in the middle of Old 40 coming towards us, and so we turned around as fast as we could, and of course we wasn't going 80 or 90 mile an hour, got back into town, and then we went up on the interstate bypass there, and we could see the tornadoes going to the west. They went up and hit Blue Line Club, which is a pheasant farm up there, and then we could see they were going on north and west. And then I think Gene got a call and said that they needed an ambulance in Niles, and so we went into Niles, come into Niles from the west, and I can remember, how strange it was, because there was great big farm trucks upside down with the wheels in the air, and the air smelled of electricity, from all the transformers and stuff blowing, and then I don't know how we found where Mrs. Bell was, but her house was flattened within 2 or 3 feet. It was only standing about 2 or 3 feet high, and she was down in a hole there. I don't know if it put her down in there or if she was down in there trying to get away from the storm, but she was dead. Then we got her out and put her on a gurney and took her to Salina, and it didn't seem to bother me at the time, but it bothered me after I'd done it, that I'd picked up a dead person, and I rode in the back. She was, we knew she was dead, so I rode all the way to the hospital with her on a gurney there. Niles was probably sticks in my mind more than the Clay Center, because it was, we picked up a person that had been killed in a storm. And I remember picking her up, and of course, and she was cut all up, but there was no blood. She was cut up after she'd died, I think, because you would bleed, I would think, if you were cut. But I think she either had a heart attack, or I don't know if the storm killed her, but her heart had quit beating, otherwise it'd pump blood all over the place. But there wasn't hardly any blood. I remember that part. But it's some of the hardships. I can handle them better when I'm older than I could when I was younger. It's just a lot more realistic that it's going to happen sometime, And
then we drove back uptown, and it was just a mess. You couldn't see. There were power lines down, and we did talk to some of the people in Niles and said that Mrs. Bell had run a restaurant in Niles, and one of the big great tanks had bumped her house, and she was down under the counter in the restaurant, and a cigarette machine fell over on her and had killed her. I don't remember exactly who did find her, but I know she was, the cigarette machine was laying on her, and they were pretty heavy. You know how them old cigarette machines were pretty heavy. And I don't know if she was sitting, it fell like this, and she wasn't clear under the counter or something, but Mrs. Bell was probably my age that I am now. That was the only fatality out of that, but it just tore everybody's house up in town almost, either very major to medium damage. And by golly, the next morning, Charlie Boster from Bennington was in charge of the Red Cross in, Salina or Ottaway, but anyway, he lived in Bennington, and he came down here with a group of people, and they were serving coffee and sandwiches, and then a lot of people, just looky-loos were running around every place, but the grain tanks were so huge that it was going to take a dozer to move them, because they were heavy iron. They were 55 foot tall and about 30 to 35 feet in diameter, but heavy gauge iron. And so Bob Drummond had an old Alice Chalmers high loader on tracks, and he went and got it and started pushing what he could with it. It was probably a 60 horsepower unit, which wasn't very big, but between the mud and the debris, the lumber and the tin and just everything, people's clothes laying in the street, and of course there was no water, no utilities, no lights, no heat. But the next day, the Mennonites showed up from down at Mound Ridge. I think I had 2 busloads of them, and they started doing the handwork of picking up the lumber and piling it up, and these people were all volunteer. One comment I do want to make, that the tornado that hit Niles in '73 ruined this town, because we didn't have a whole lot going anyway, but we had a post office, and we did have a little cafe where the lady got killed. elevator lost 60% of its storage. They had about 500,000 bushels of wheat in a flat storage when the tornado hit right here at Niles. It was part of the elevator. It wasn't part of the elevator, but it was elevator stored grain in a separate metal building, and it tore the roof off of it and got all that wheat, got that 8, 9, 10 inches of rain on it. And the Niles never did recover from the tornado. The post office did stay open. In fact, my wife was the postmaster there for 14 years. So I would say, in my opinion, the tornado of '73 was a grave marker or a gravestone for the town of Niles, Kansas.
This was page one, the day that I retired, and they used the picture that I shot of Dwight Eisenhower on that day. He came to Abilene with a whole entourage of national press, of course, and I believe it was Eric Severide that interviewed him over there, and they decided to do it outside his home. So they had blocked off with cars a ring around where they were going to be shooting, or where they were going to be interviewing him. And Severide would sit in one chair and Ike would sit in another, and they'd chat back and forth. And we were not allowed to shoot when they were interviewing. I suppose the camera clicks and everything else. And I can't really tell you how many newspaper photographers there were there, but there were a lot of them. And all of a sudden, one of the guys in the back, I suppose the producer, yelled, "Cut, let's take a break." And my fellow photographers seemed to think that he was talking to him, because I can remember most of them swung around and sat down on the ground and leaned into the cars that they'd been looking over to shoot. But I stayed up at the time, and this lady jumped up with a toothbrush and started combing Eisenhower's hair. And I took that picture, and we ran in the paper. AP picked it up, and then I was contacted by Life magazine, who wanted to run it too. So I ended up getting about $200 for that picture, as I recall.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Climate change, I think it's here. I think it's here to stay, and I worry about my grandchildren in this world. If you believe the scientists, and I do, I think we're in for a heck of a ride in the next 50, 60 years and further on. I hope they can figure out a way to get it turned around. You think with all these smart people out there, if the politicians will give them a chance, they'll figure out a way to take part of that carbon dioxide that we're throwing up there and stopping the sun rays or holding them in, or whatever it's doing. They'll figure out a way to dissipate that. But I feel like in a lot of ways we're living the right generation. I worry about the generations to follow, I really do, because of climate change and all it's going to do.
I agree completely with this person. I think the most compelling reason to deal with climate change is because it's a fundamentally unfair situation for our kids and our grandkids. Because the planet has lots of water, because there's that delay in the system, what we do to the thermostat today, our kids have to live with. and what they do to the thermostat, their kids have to live with. There's always at least 1 to 2 generations lag. And that's unfair. I have grandkids. I have kids. And it is very painful to me as a climate scientist to know what's coming and then to play with my grandkids and to recognize that they're the ones who are going to have to deal with the crap we leave behind. And that's difficult. To me, this is the most compelling reason for dealing with this problem and dealing with it now, is the unfairness of making this my kids' problem.
Certainly over the years, I've seen a change in climate just as I grew up. I mean, when I was a kid, there was a lot more snow, a lot more cold weather, and your year was pretty predictable. At certain times it did this, and then in the spring everything came out pretty, and so that has changed over time to where now it's much warmer than. Well, this year was unusual. We had some snow, but for several years prior we had no snow, and it's like, this is crazy. So certainly things are changing, and I think it's something that we're doing. Well, I think we need to stop and think about what fuel, make some changes. Go to wind instead of all the carbon, and I don't know if it'll ever happen, but it makes sense.
I agree with this person as well. It's one of the really interesting challenges of climate change is that it doesn't happen immediately. Although I have to put a big caveat on that, because there have been times in Earth's history when we have had huge changes in climate in a very short period of time, a matter of a few years. We haven't seen that. We haven't had what we call an abrupt climate change. If we did, perhaps we would all take this challenge a bit more seriously than we do. That said, you see change, but if it's taking 10, 20, 30 years for it to have effect, then really only those folks who've been around for 30, 40, 50 years are the ones who are going to say, you know what, I've seen it in my lifetime. I've seen it in my lifetime. I've been going to Greenland for 30 years, and I have seen change. I have seen temperatures increase. I have seen melting in places where we never thought we would see melting. I have seen polar bears wandering 300 miles from their habitat in search of food in areas where they never went before. I've been drilling ice cores for 30 years, and we never thought that we would have to deal with polar bears on top of the ice sheet. That's changed. That world is now a reality. That we have to look over our shoulder when you get up in the middle of the night and walk out there. You have to look over your shoulder. Is there something out there? So yes, I've seen change. But if a change happens slowly, it's a challenge to get people to accept it and to deal with it. It's probably always a little easier to adapt to it than it is to actually deal with it. That's one of the big challenges with climate change, is that it happens slowly. It has a freight train-like character to it. So once it gets going, you're not going to stop. So once sea level starts rising and rising and rising, it's not like we're going to turn around and say, no, it's going to stop rising. It's going to continue to rise.
We had an Easterner back here one time, and he had never been on a gravel road before, never been on a county road, never been on anything that wasn't paved. And some of the guys had him convinced for a while that the windmills out in the pastures were there to cool the cows. So.
Well, one of the things that I hesitate to use is climate deniers. It's more likely to cause divisions and to harden people in a certain frame of mind. What we really need to do is look at what is the science. And the science is a very basic component that can be debated and understood. It's not an act of faith, and that is one of the areas where it tends to be that anyone who questions a particular hypothesis is labeled as a denier, when the history of science, and by science in its very nature, is that all things are open to question, and that is the way we advance science. So you can't say that the science is settled if you want to increase your understanding about a particular system. So that's where you really need to look at how do we understand the climate now? What are our limitations on that understanding, and what research can we do to improve the understanding of the dynamics of the climate system, which are very, very complex. Some people have said, well, you can predict when there is going to be a lunar eclipse, and therefore we can predict what's going to happen with climate. The reality of that is that with a lunar eclipse, there are only 3 components that determine whether or not there will be an eclipse, and those are very fixed. It's the rotation of the sun, the rotation of the earth, and the orbit of the moon. Those are only minimally changed over eons. When you talk about climate, there are a huge number of interactive and negative and positive feedbacks and forcings, and to be able to understand all of those is just the beginning of our understanding of science. And we haven't been studying climate for nearly so long as people have been studying astronomy. So again, the expectation that everything is understood and is completely reliable and reportable is not accurate. One of the things that comes into play with that is there is a tendency on both sides to take a particular event as proof of their stance. So if there is a cool day in July, those that you term climate deniers will say, hey, there's no global warming because, hey, it's cool in July. Conversely, if there's a big rain event, those that are proponents of human impact on climate change will say, hey, this has never happened before, and it's the storm of the century, and therefore it's proof of our understanding of climate change. And both exaggerations are less than useful. What's better is to look at how can we document how our environment is changing and how our role is impacting that change, and how can we minimize our impact on the environment around us.
Climate change. It's a joke. Yeah, we have climate change 4 times a year, the 4 seasons of the year. I can remember in the 70s when they said we were going to go into the deep freeze again. And then later, many years later, but now they're saying we're in the furnace again, except for the last 15 years, they've been proven that the temperatures are actually going down. So you got one side that says it's going down, one side that says it's going up, one side says it's not man-made, one side says it is man-made. And I will tell you what I stand on that thing. I don't believe in it. I think it's hocus pocus. I think it's government control trying to take our money. And it's they gain more power, we lose power. It has nothing to do with climate, nothing at all. It's a political football that they're using to take away the rights of us, the people. And it has nothing to do with climate.
Yeah, I mean, he's an easy guy to refute. But
man hasn't changed anything on this earth as far as the climate.
So how did the scientific community blow it, right? Because at some point, I do believe this, right? Global warming was a bad move, because then people keyed into the concept that, oh, look, it got colder, so therefore there's no global warming. Doesn't mean that, look, we all can get caught in attempting to frame a narrative and not doing it right. That didn't help. The other piece of it that's obvious is the way in which science is politicized, right? The sense that, every fact can be debated. So you could see that in his piece, right? You do this. It's like, no, not every fact gets to be debated. There's complete consensus on this. And he doesn't know that, because he listens to people who tell him that there isn't.
And this consensus thing, scientists don't just take a vote. They have to have proof. They don't even have proof. They say they have proof. They don't. They put their little ideas about, well, what's going on into a computer, and this thing spits out some kind of forecast. And somebody else can put in a little something different, and they get a little different forecast.
Well, the thing is, from a conflict, so I teach conflict resolution. And conflict resolution does require you to see the other person's point of view. You really want to resolve the conflict. You don't have to agree with them. You have to see their point of view, to understand how they came to believe what they believe. I know where this guy got his stuff from.
No, I think it's a joke. I think it's not a joke. It's not a joke because they're serious. They're idiots, except they're smart idiots because they're in power and they're going to take our money, and that's what they want. And we will have less and less rights and less money.
You accept their position as theirs. So you think climate change is just a hoax meant to take your money from you. Who exactly do you think is behind the hoax? Like, you talk them through it softly, help them find that place. And in some cases, and I've said this, it's not very popular, sometimes you just gotta know, you can't win that one. You're not gonna win that one. I have had many debates with people who hold very, very, very hard conservative views, and at some point they're just literally spitting Rush Limbaugh back. Well, I can't debate, I'm not debating Rush Limbaugh. It's like talking to someone who doesn't have a functioning brain, so it's just not going to work.
And meanwhile, the rest of us people are going to be way less wages. We're going to be giving it all to the government, and they're going to be fat and happy. No, I don't believe in climate change, man-made, any part of it.
My goal would be to make his opinions irrelevant, not to change his mind.
Well, I think it's not an uncommon sentiment. Quite frankly, it's wrong. So you live on a planet that has immutable physical principles. And if you understand those physical principles, you can make good predictions. When you get on an airplane, you're basically saying, I trust physics. Because it's physics that gives lift to wings. It's physics that says this is how fast you got to fly for the amount of weight you have. All these things are calculated. And if gravity was variable, if we didn't understand gravity, flying would be impossible. So I find it kind of interesting that we live on a planet that has such strong, unchangeable rules when we are a species that doesn't like strong, unchangeable rules. And that's really in my mind, the fundamental conflict that we see in a quote like this. There's a whole bunch of ways in which people phrase this. But the reality is that we know, that if you add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, they will trap energy. And if you trap energy, you will change climate. And it is that simple. To me, this is not an unsurprising kind of approach. But at the same time, I think it's really important for all of us as citizens of this planet to take some time to learn about how our planet functions. And I don't think this person has taken that time to learn how the planet actually functions. The example I give, or the analogy I give, is you buy a house. You sort of have a couple of choices here. You can either completely ignore the heating and cooling system and the plumbing and all that stuff, and then call an expert when something breaks, or you can try to learn a little bit about how your house functions so that you can make an informed decision about, all right, I need to call an expert, or no, I can fix that. So taking the time to learn a little bit about how the heating and air conditioning and water system works in your house is not a bad thing, right? But you also, in the end, you might have to call an expert. So who are the climate experts? Are the scientists we have, right? We're not going to call a plumber to fix a problem with our heating and air conditioning system. You're going to call the right expert to deal with the right problem. And so when you've got experts out there telling you that, you know what, you put this much CO2 in the atmosphere, you're going to change the planet, right? You should listen to them.
It's just a lot more realistic that it's going to happen sometime, 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 sometime,
But it is of some value when you're in a meeting and you think, I can kick that guy in the head. It's good, just good to know.